They had stopped checking on him every hour, not out of neglect, but necessity. Room 209 was quiet, and in a hospital like Street Gabriel's, quiet often meant the end was near. The monitors still blinked. The IV still dripped. But the man in the bed, Arthur Lindsley, 84 years old, stage 4 lung cancer, hadn't opened his eyes in days. No visitors since his niece last came with a book of Psalms and left it unopened on the nightstand. The nurses whispered kindly about him in the hallway. He was a professor, one said. History, I think, taught for 40 years, never married. Another nodded, lowering her voice. I think he's waiting for someone. The night shift nurse, Mari, was the only one who stayed longer than necessary. She had a habit of straightening the blankets after the others had gone. She said it helped her think. That Tuesday night, the hallway lights dimmed at 10 as usual. Mari walked past room 209 and paused. The sound was faint at first, like humming. She opened the door quietly. The machines made their usual rhythmic sounds. The television was off, but Arthur's lips were moving. She stepped closer. He wasn't mumbling nonsense. He was whispering, clear, low, steady, as if answering a question. Mari leaned in, heart quickening. His eyes remained closed, but his brow furrowed as though deep in concentration. She could just make out the words, I'm not afraid. Not anymore. Then a pause. Then, barely audible, Is that you? Mari stayed frozen. Her skin prickled. The air in the room had changed, subtly. Warmer, though the thermostat hadn't shifted. And then, just as suddenly, the whispering stopped. Arthur exhaled a long breath and went still again. She checked his pulse, stronger than expected. She noted it and walked back to the nurse's station without speaking. The next morning, the day nurse assumed Mari had dozed off and imagined things. He's been unresponsive for over a week, she said, tapping at the tablet with the updated chart. No meds changed, no family called. It's just the final plateau. But Mari said nothing. She'd worked too many nights, seen too many passings. What she'd felt in that room didn't feel like the end. It felt like the moment before a question is answered. Down the hall, just past the elevators, was the chapel. Small, plain, mostly unused. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and the altar cloth hadn't been changed in weeks. But something new sat in the corner, something no one had noticed until that day. A statue of the Virgin Mary, life-sized. Pale blue robes, hands folded in prayer, gaze tilted downward as if watching someone sleep. No one had signed it in, no delivery record, no donor plaque. But there she stood, silent and still, in the only corner where the light didn't flicker. And that morning, as Arthur Lindsley slept in the room they had already given up on, the lilies outside the chapel bloomed out of season. The hospital had seen donations before paintings for the children's wing, an old piano for the cancer center lobby, even a stained glass window installed after a nurse passed unexpectedly from leukemia. But those came with paperwork, phone calls, dedication plaques, and press releases. This didn't. The Virgin Mary statue in the chapel simply appeared. No crate, no receipt, no invoice, no note. Just there, standing in the far right corner of the room between the votive candles and the faded wooden prayer bench, as though she had always been. At first, the staff assumed it had been placed by the auxiliary board. Sister Eleanor, who oversaw the pastoral care team, swore she hadn't requested it. If someone donated a life-size marble statue, she said, I think I'd remember the conversation. Maintenance was called in to check the records. Nothing. Shipping logs for the previous week listed nothing heavier than a cart of medical textbooks. There were no camera records of it being delivered, no janitor assigned to place it. Yet there she stood, carved from what looked like Carrara marble, eyes lowered in solemn grace, robes flowing in soft waves down to her feet, bare and resting gently on a crescent moon. Chaplain Romero was the first to raise a formal question. He was a practical man, a former Marine who found faith in Afghanistan. He didn't dismiss miracles outright, but he preferred his mysteries with edges. After inspecting the statue himself, he logged a quiet request with administration, find the source, for insurance purposes, if nothing else. They thanked him and nodded, but days passed. No answers came. Meanwhile, patients started noticing. A woman waiting for her mammogram wandered into the chapel and didn't leave for half an hour. She returned the next day with her husband, neither of them saying much. Another man, visiting his brother in the cardiac ward, said the statue's face reminded him of his grandmother. "Same eyes," he said, like she's about to say something kind you're not ready to hear. Staff avoided discussing it openly. Nurses called it the quiet lady. Orderlies said she made the chapel less cold. Even Romero, despite his cautious tone, began pausing a little longer than usual during his rounds. The flowers left at the base of the statue increased. Not roses or lilies, but small things, daisy petals folded into tissue paper, a child's drawing taped near her feet, a ring of coffee-stained prayer cards someone tucked into the hem of her robe. One morning, Mari passed the chapel after her shift. The light from the stained glass window caught the statue's face just right, and for a moment, the marble didn't look like stone at all. It looked soft, like flesh remembering warmth. She didn't step inside, she didn't speak, but she crossed herself, quietly, and walked away. 2 doors down, in room 209, Arthur Lindsley stirred again and whispered something the monitors didn't record. Mari wasn't the superstitious type. She believed in compassion and science and gut instincts honed over 20 years on the night shift. She had learned how to spot death before it made itself known when a patient stopped checking the clock, when the room temperature felt a little too still. But none of that explained what she heard that Thursday just before dawn. The halls were quiet, save for the hum of machines and the distant clang of an elevator. She had stepped into the staff lounge for a cup of coffee, the kind that tasted more like cardboard than caffeine, when she heard it again, a woman's voice. Not a scream, not a cry for help. A whisper, steady, clear, and close. It came from down the corridor, near the chapel. Mari set her cup down, walked slowly past the empty nurse's station, and followed the sound. She stopped, just outside the chapel door, her hand hovering near the light switch. The whispering stopped the moment she reached the threshold. Not faded, stopped. As if someone knew she was coming, she flicked on the light. The chapel was empty. The same cracked hymnals sat on the back row pew. The same flickering LED candles lined the windowsill. And the statue, the Virgin Mary, stood in the corner, exactly where she had the day before. But something felt different. The air was heavier, though not in an oppressive way. Like walking into a room mid-conversation and catching only the emotional echo, Mari took a step inside. Her eyes went to the statue's face. It hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. But there was something in the angle of her head, the softness of her eyes, that made Mari feel watched, not judged, not measured, witnessed. She crossed the room slowly and sat on the edge of the front pew, eyes never leaving the statue. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing stirred. And just when she stood to leave, she heard it again, not in her ears, but somewhere just behind the bones of her chest. A whisper, too soft to be a voice, but too distinct to be her own thought. He is not alone. She blinked, heart pounding. She turned around, but no one was there. The whisper was gone. The room was still. Mari stood for another moment, then left without a word, the faint creak of the pew echoing behind her. At the end of the hallway, she passed room 209. Something pulled at her gently, not urgently. She peeked inside. Arthur was asleep, but not as he had been. His face was different, less sunken. The furrow in his brow had softened. His hand twitched once, as if reaching for someone. She backed away slowly and returned to the nurse's station. She didn't write a report. She didn't mention the voice. But she sat in silence for the rest of her shift, glancing now and then down the hallway toward the chapel, toward the statue, and toward a man who was supposed to be dying, but somehow wasn't. Hospitals are full of clocks. You don't realize it until you stop listening for anything else. The tick of wall units in waiting rooms, the slow green pulse of digital monitors, the rhythmic ping from IV pumps. But for some reason, the one time that seems to echo louder than all the rest is 3:33 a.m. The third time it happened, the security team took notice. The overnight monitor system logged a glitch in the C-wing hallway, a brief static distortion on the camera feed directly outside the chapel. Nothing unusual in a building this old. But the timestamp was the same as it had been the 2 nights prior. 3:33 a.m. down to the second. First they blamed the hardware, then the wiring. But each playback showed the same strange thing. Room 209's door would ease open slightly on its own. Just an inch. Enough to shift shadows in the hallway. Then came the flicker soft, like candlelight spilling where it shouldn't. The statue in the chapel never moved on camera, of course. But in the grainy footage, light seemed to glint off her eyes, even when the room was in total darkness. And then, always, the frame would freeze, not go black, just pause, as if time itself had taken a breath. In the room, Arthur would sit up, not bolt, not gasp, just slowly rise, his thin back folding upright, his eyes opening wide. Staff said he hadn't had the strength to lift a hand. And yet here he was, 3 nights in a row, seated in silence, his face turned toward the open door as though listening. The footage never caught what came next. Just a skip, a blink of missing time. The nurses began whispering about it. Not loudly, not during shift changes, but in corners. "Did you see the way he looked at me this morning? He hasn't needed morphine since Monday." I swear he was humming, just for a second. No one reported it officially, but every morning after, someone new left a candle at the statue's base. Chaplain Romero reviewed the footage himself on a Friday morning. He said nothing at first, just watched the screen, arms crossed, eyes narrowing slightly at the timestamp. 3:33. Again, he rewound, played it once more, then leaned back and rubbed his jaw. "Let me know," he said finally, "if it happens a fourth time." That night, Mari requested to cover the hallway. She didn't explain why. She just stayed seated near the nurse's station, her eyes fixed on the clock above the door. At 3:31, the hallway was silent. At 3:32, she stood and walked toward room 209. At 3:33, the lights in the chapel flickered. The door to 209 creaked open again. And when Mari looked inside, she didn't see a man on the edge of death. She saw Arthur Lindsley, eyes open, whispering to someone, only he could see his hand reaching upward, palm open, like a man asking to be lifted. His name was Jonah, 23, part-time, and barely into his second month on the job. He worked the early mornings, usually quiet, mostly mopping floors, wheeling carts between wings, replacing hand sanitizer refills no one ever thanked him for. The chapel wasn't part of his normal rounds. He didn't even know there was one until a nurse handed him a checklist and said, "Don't forget the prayer room. We've had visitors lately." He pushed his mop bucket through the C-wing with earbuds in, halfway through a podcast on haunted lighthouses, when the playlist glitched. Just static, no music, then silence. His phone screen froze at 3:33. He chuckled to himself, remembering a meme about that time of night being cursed, then pushed open the chapel door. The lights were off, not unusual. No one ever left them on. But moonlight from the stained glass window caught the statue of the Virgin Mary, just enough to cast her shadow long and soft across the floor. Jonah stood there for a second, not moving, suddenly unsure why he felt nervous. Then he stepped in. He swept the mop across the floor in slow figure eights. The statue stood where she had all week, hands folded, gaze lowered. But tonight he swore it felt like she was turned a few degrees more toward the room, as if she had listened to something and shifted slightly to hear it better. He laughed out loud, shaking his head. "Too many ghost stories," he mumbled. He turned his back to rinse the mop. That's when it happened. A breath. Not a sound. Not the creak of wood or the hum of pipes. A breath. Close. Human. Soft. He spun around. No one there. But the statue, it felt different. The room felt different. Warmer. Denser. And the scent, he hadn't noticed it before, was unmistakable now. Lilies. Fresh, wet, and blooming in a room where no flowers had been in days. Jonah stepped backward, nearly slipping on the damp floor. He dropped the mop. It clattered. He didn't pick it up. He backed out of the chapel, never taking his eyes off the statue, his heart pounding hard enough to make his chest feel tight. By the time he reached the break room, he was pale. He signed himself out, told no one the full story, just left. The next morning, he submitted his resignation by email. Said the schedule didn't work for him anymore, that he was transferring schools, that he needed time off. Later, Mari found the mop still lying across the floor. The bucket had tipped slightly. Water pooled in a wide arc around the statue's base. And in that wet sheen, right where the light cut across the floor, she noticed something strange. Footprints, bare, small, leading away from the statue and vanishing halfway across the room. Mari didn't tell anyone. She just grabbed a towel, wiped the water, and whispered beneath her breath as she did, "You're not here to scare us, are you?" The voice recorder had been left on by accident. Mari had placed it on the bedside table in room 209 the night before, intending to transcribe notes later Arthur's breathing patterns, any irregular murmurs, anything the day staff might want to track. He hadn't spoken in hours. She expected silence. Maybe a cough. Maybe a few rasps of breath. But what played back the next morning was something else entirely. It started around 3:33. A low hum, barely audible, followed by Arthur's voice, soft, hoarse, but steady. The transcription software flagged it as unknown language. When she played it again with headphones on, Mari felt her stomach drop. It wasn't gibberish. It was a prayer. Latin. She recognized parts from the old mass she'd grown up hearing with her grandmother. Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. But the words Arthur spoke weren't always in the right order. Some were older, some rolled off his tongue like he had spoken them for decades. But he hadn't. His chart listed no formal religious affiliation. His records said nothing about classical languages. She brought the recording to Chaplain Romero. He listened with furrowed brows, eyes closed, lips slightly parted. When it ended, he said nothing at first, just sat in stillness. Then, "That's not just a Hail Mary, that's part of the Salve Regina. And that phrase near the end, Domina Lucis Aeternii, haven't heard that since seminary, it's rarely used." His voice dropped. "It means Lady of Eternal Light. It's not in any of the patient's files?" Mari shook her head. But what unsettled her more wasn't the Latin, it was the other word Arthur spoke near the end. In English, clearly and with unmistakable tenderness. Margaret. He said it 3 times. Once like a plea, once like a greeting, once like a prayer. There was no Margaret on staff, no Margaret in the family contacts. Mari double-checked the intake forms, his next of kin, even the old emergency contact line. Nothing. It was as if the name had risen from nowhere but not nowhere. That evening, Mari sat with Arthur during her break, curious, cautious. He didn't open his eyes, but his lips twitched slightly. She took his hand frail, paper thin, and whispered, "Who's Margaret?" Arthur didn't respond, but his fingers moved ever so slightly, curling inwards, like holding the edge of a memory too precious to say aloud. Later, she passed the chapel again. The statue stood where it always did, lit only by the final slant of dusk through the stained glass. But tonight, someone had placed a single white rose at her feet, and tucked beneath it a note, folded neatly, sealed with wax. Mari didn't touch it. She didn't have to. The name was written clearly across the outside. Margaret Lindsley. She stared at it for a long moment, then walked away, half afraid to open it, half afraid not to. The chapel wasn't known for its beauty. It was a room you passed through, not one you lingered in. The linoleum floor peeled at the corners. The cushions on the pews were threadbare and uneven. A water stain marred the ceiling tile above the altar like a faint thumbprint. But something had shifted since the statue arrived. People entered more slowly now, sat longer, left with a kind of reluctant quiet in their steps, like they were leaving behind something they weren't quite ready to walk away from. That Friday morning, the flowers bloomed. It started with a bouquet of wilted lilies off-white, their stems sagging from a dollar store vase tucked beside the base of the Virgin Mary statue. No one knew who placed them there. The maintenance staff was strict about floral policies due to patient allergies, and the chapel had been under no live plants designation for years. But these had been overlooked, or perhaps permitted without anyone remembering. By all logic, they should have been thrown out. Instead, they opened. Not slowly over days, but suddenly, overnight. Mari found them first. She had come in early to think to sit on the back pew and not feel like a nurse for a few minutes. The moment she stepped in, she smelled them. Sweet, sharp, alive. She blinked at the bouquet. The petals were no longer curled inward. They were full, vibrant, reaching gently toward the chapel's dim light as though they'd just been picked. Dew beaded at the tips. The scent was unmistakable. She walked toward them slowly, as if approaching something sacred. The lilies were fresh, but the stems remained the same, dry and fraying at the base. No water had been added. The vase was still empty. She didn't report it. She didn't touch them. She just sat down and watched the way the statue seemed to tilt ever so slightly toward them. Not enough to call it a movement, but enough to wonder if she'd always leaned like that. Later, a visitor noticed. Then another. By noon, someone had taken a photo and left a handwritten note under the vase. For my sister gone too soon. If you're listening, watch over her. It wasn't signed. The following day, a second bouquet appeared, this one with forget-me-nots and a single sprig of rosemary. And then a third. Word spread in whispers. No press releases. No hospital memo. Just hushed hallway conversations and sideways glances toward the chapel door. Chaplain Romero stood before the statue that evening longer than usual. He didn't speak, didn't pray aloud. But when he turned to leave, Mari saw him wipe the edge of his eye, his fingers lingering at his cheek like he wasn't sure if he'd been crying or if something had brushed him in passing. That night, in room 209, Arthur Lindsley stirred again. He whispered a single phrase, "She's standing in the light." And for the first time, the monitors recorded a full breath, steady, strong, and not labored at all. Dr. Evelyn Price had no room in her worldview for miracles. She wasn't cold, just efficient, a practitioner of order, of numbers, of blood panels and imaging scans. She'd been Arthur Lindsley's attending for nearly 2 months and had watched the slow, steady decline of a man whose body was no longer interested in resisting. His lungs were failing. His appetite had vanished. His extremities cooled more each day. She'd prepared the family what little of it there was for the final phase. So when the morning rounds report came across her tablet with a note from the night shift nurse, vitals stronger than previous baseline, she frowned. Not improved. Not stable. Stronger. She pulled up his chart. Pulse in the 70s. Oxygen levels climbing above 90%. Blood pressure inching toward normal range. His respiratory rate had halved since the previous week. No supplemental oxygen increase. And perhaps most confusing, he had spoken again, briefly, but clearly. Sitting up unassisted, the note said, appeared calm, alert, whispered something about light. She reran the labs. Twice. The cancer markers were still present but lower. Significantly, as if the disease had slowed its grip. As if the body had found, all on its own, a way to pause the clock. Evelyn didn't say the word miracle. She said anomaly. That's what the report called it too. Temporary anomaly. But the nurses didn't seem surprised. They just nodded, quiet, careful, their eyes flicking toward the hallway where the chapel stood, like a question no one wanted to answer. Evelyn walked there herself that afternoon. She didn't often take time to visit the spiritual wing. It felt extraneous. But today, she stepped inside, arms folded, her white coat catching the dusty light filtering through the stained glass panel of St. Raphael above the altar. The statue stood in the corner, just as everyone described. She was smaller than Evelyn expected, not towering or grand, just present. The marble robe was smooth, but not polished. Her gaze was cast downward, not at the altar or the cross, but slightly off-center, toward where someone might sit if they needed to be seen but not acknowledged. A nurse entered behind her, unaware she was there, and placed a single candle at the statue's feet before slipping out again. Evelyn remained still. The scent of lilies hung faintly in the air, impossible, since the fresh flowers had been removed that morning due to hospital policy. She checked the time, 3:33 p.m., not the hour of death, she thought, but maybe the echo of it. She left without lighting a candle. Later, in her office, she updated the chart. Patient exhibiting unexpected signs of stabilization. She hovered over the note, then added, no medical explanation currently available. Monitor closely. Then she paused. And for the first time in her career, she added a phrase she never thought she'd write. Await further insight. The second voice came from a floor above. Room 317 wasn't notable. It was quiet, tucked at the far end of the oncology wing. The kind of room that stayed dim even when the blinds were open. The man inside, Joseph Marquez, was not expected to make it through the weekend. Stage 5, glioblastoma. The tumors had spread rapidly, pressing into parts of his brain that dulled his speech and left him with long hours of confused silence. But early Sunday morning, just before the floor lights flickered to their daytime setting, he spoke. The nurse on duty, a soft-spoken Haitian woman named Eliza, was finishing her rounds when she heard the words, clear, crisp, not slurred like before, not muttered like a dream. He said, she told me to wait. Eliza froze. Joseph hadn't spoken in days. When he did, It was usually half-formed syllables or jumbled phrases. But this was a sentence. She stepped closer to the bed. His eyes were open, not unfocused or distant, but steady, watching something just past her shoulder. She said the light comes after breath, he whispered again. Eliza checked his monitors. His oxygen saturation had increased. His pulse was steady. She pressed the call button and began checking his pupils. Joseph's eyes followed her finger without delay. She asked softly, "Who told you that?" He blinked slowly. "The woman in the hallway," he said, as if the answer was obvious. "The one with the flowers." There were no visitors scheduled for Joseph that night. No women on the floor wearing flowers. No sounds in the hallway except the usual wheel squeaks and distant monitor beeps. Eliza noted the time, 3:33 a.m., and made her report. She didn't include the part about the flowers, or the woman, or the fact that when she glanced at the door, it felt like someone had just left it. By noon, Joseph was gone. Not in fear, not in pain, just gone. He died with a strange smile on his face, the kind that comes when you see someone familiar waiting in the distance. Eliza was the one who found him. She didn't cry. She folded his blanket gently, whispered a quiet prayer, and turned off the machines. Before she left the room, she stepped into the hallway and looked toward the elevator, then toward the chapel downstairs. Later that day, she visited it for the first time since transferring to Street Gabriel's. She didn't know what she expected to find, but when she entered, the scent of lilies met her like an old song. The statue stood quietly in the corner, unchanged. Or maybe not unchanged. The folds of the marble robe seemed softer than before. The mouth, just slightly, just possibly tilted into the faintest echo of a smile. Eliza sat in the last pew, and for the first time in years, she whispered something she didn't even know she remembered how to say. "Thank you." No one ever saw her arrive. That was the first strange thing. The volunteer log was always kept meticulously up-to-date clipboard near the entrance, each name followed by a signature, arrival time, and department. But that Thursday afternoon, just before sunset, a candy striper on her way to pediatrics passed a woman she didn't recognize in the east hallway. She was older, perhaps in her 70s, wearing what looked like an outdated habit, simple, navy blue, no veil, her silver hair pulled back into a low bun. She was barefoot. That part stood out the most. Barefoot, in a hospital, silent, moving slowly, but not frail. She held a bundle of white lilies cradled in both arms like a newborn, and the look on her face was something the volunteer would later describe only as unshakable peace. The girl turned to greet her, maybe to offer help, but by the time she glanced back, the hallway was empty. No doors had opened, no sound of footsteps, just gone. Later, she mentioned it to the floor receptionist, who frowned. "There's no one matching that description on the visitor list," she said. "You sure it wasn't one of the nuns from the hospice program?" The girl shook her head. "We don't have hospice here." By evening, the story had traveled in whispers. Two more staff members claimed to have seen her once near the elevator bank, one standing just outside the chapel. In both cases, she was described the same. Older, barefoot, quiet, holding lilies. And in both cases, she never spoke. Security reviewed the cameras. They expected a dead zone. Instead, they found something worse. At 5:27 p.m., every feed along the east corridor blinked out for exactly 1 minute and 33 seconds. No static, no error code. Just black. When the screens returned, everything was as it had been except for one thing. The chapel lights were on. No one had turned them on. Chaplain Romero was called in that evening. He walked the corridor himself, slowly, prayerfully. He opened the chapel door with his hand pressed gently to the cross at his chest. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood exactly where it had stood for weeks now, but tonight the chapel felt warmer, brighter. A single white lily lay across the foot of the altar, not at the base of the statue, not placed like an offering. It was simply resting there, as though carried in and laid down with intention. Romero didn't touch it. He didn't speak. He only knelt. That same night, Mari checked in on room 209 before clocking out. Arthur was asleep, peaceful, his breathing even. She adjusted his blanket, made a note on the chart, and turned to leave. Just before the door closed, she heard him whisper, half in a dream, "She was here, she brought flowers." It started as a faint perfume, a trace in the air, like something clinging to memory more than matter. Mari noticed it first on her evening rounds. Room 209 had always carried the scent of antiseptic alcohol swabs, latex gloves, the faint sterile tang that clung to every hospital corner. But on Monday, as she stepped inside with Arthur's chart in hand, something else greeted her. Lilies. She paused in the doorway. There were no flowers in the room, no diffusers, no perfume, and yet the fragrance was unmistakable, soft, floral, rich, without being overwhelming. She checked the bed, the table, the air vents. Nothing out of place. She jotted down a note and moved on, assuming it would pass. But it didn't. By Tuesday, 2 other nurses commented on it. Room 209's got a smell, one said, scrunching her nose. Not bad, just weird. Like Easter Sunday. Another shrugged. Better than what I usually smell in here. But by Wednesday, even the day staff had noticed. One aide walked in to check Arthur's 4 and walked out a minute later, blinking hard. It's so strong in there, like someone spilled a bottle of holy oil or something. Makes your eyes sting. Still, no one found the source. Environmental Services ran a full inspection. Vents were clean, filters replaced, no scent in any of the adjacent rooms, nothing in the linens. No staff member claimed to have worn perfume or cologne. The patient himself remained calm, stable, even more so than in recent weeks. And yet the scent intensified, especially after dark. Mary stayed late that night. She brought a candle, unlit, and sat quietly in the corner of room 209, just past the monitor cables and supply cart. Arthur was asleep, mouth slightly open, his hand resting over his chest like a man listening to a lullaby. The smell of lilies hung in the air like a fog, not thick, but inescapable. It didn't move. It didn't dissipate. It hovered like presence. She whispered, "Are you here again?" There was no reply. But the candle, though unlit, grew warm in her hand. The next morning, Chaplain Romero returned to the room after receiving yet another report about the unexplained fragrance. He stood at the foot of the bed and closed his eyes. Scent has always been a sign, he said quietly. In the old stories, in the lives of the saints, lilies at death, roses in visions, sweetness where decay should be. He turned to Mari and added, "Maybe she's closer than we think." That afternoon, the fragrance was gone. Completely. As if it had never been there. Staff checked, sniffed, asked one another if they were imagining things. But the air was empty again. Clean, normal. Only Arthur noticed the difference. When Mari checked in on him at shift change, he opened his eyes, just barely, and said with surprising clarity, "She stepped out, but she'll be back." It was just a smudge at first. A faint impression on the inside of the privacy curtain around Arthur's bed, where staff sometimes leaned while adjusting monitors or medications. Mari noticed it during a late shift, while doing a routine vitals check. The light from the hallway cast it in partial shadow, a blurry oval with 5 faded streaks. A handprint, she thought, but not sharp. Not fresh. More like something breathed into fabric, left behind by warmth. She reached out and touched it. It wasn't damp, not oily, not sticky, just there, quiet and ghost-like. She mentioned it casually to Sarah, the CNA on rotation. "Might want to swap the curtain soon. Looks like someone left a print." Sarah nodded, wheeled in a replacement from storage, and drew the old one aside. As she folded it, something strange caught Mari's eye. The handprint wasn't on the outside. It was on the inner fold between the 2 layers of the curtain, where no one's hand could reasonably press. She said nothing, just stared at the fabric and felt the hairs on her arms rise, like the room itself was watching her. The new curtain went up. The old one was bagged and sent to laundry. But the next morning, the laundry tag was returned with a note. "Unusual residue. Not detergent. Reactive. Will reprocess." The handprint hadn't washed out. That evening, a nurse named Cole, who rarely worked that wing, was called in for an overnight shift. He was pragmatic, a skeptic, known for eye rolls at chapel stories and grumblings about ghost hospital nonsense. But when he came into room 209 to adjust Arthur's bed angle, he stopped mid-movement. "Who's been sitting with him?" he asked. Mari looked up. "No one's charted a visitor." Cole frowned. "Someone must have been here." That curtain's pulled halfway, and the chairs turned facing the statue. Mari checked the chart. No visitors logged, no signs of entry. The camera footage, when reviewed, showed nothing, no motion, no staff, no activity in or out, and yet the chair remained turned, and a faint warmth lingered in the vinyl seat. By the end of the week, new curtains had been installed, but every morning the same mark would appear always in the same place. A faint, five-fingered impression pressed into the fabric from the side facing the wall. Clean, gentle, never smudged. As if someone stood at the edge of the bed night after night, parting the veil just enough to watch. Chaplain Romero said nothing, but started carrying a small vial of holy water with him. Mari didn't need it. She began to speak to the empty room when she entered. Not out of fear, out of respect. "Thank you for staying with him," she whispered once. And though no voice answered back, she saw it. The curtain swayed, just slightly, and the scent of lilies returned, for a moment, like a memory walking softly through the dark. It happened on a Thursday, just after shift change, during the brief hour when night and day staff passed one another like ships exchanging whispered burdens. Mari was clocking out late again, lingering in the chapel longer than usual, while a younger nurse named Avery prepped the IV line for Arthur's evening fluids. Everything had become routine now, vitals checked, medications noted, silence maintained. Arthur was stable, quiet, peaceful. Then, without warning, the machines went silent. Not failed, not alarmed, silent. No beeping, no whirring, no hiss from the oxygen monitor, no pulse tone, just stillness. Avery froze mid-step, her hand on the tubing. The heart monitor was still on green light, blinking steadily, but the screen was blank. No waveform, no numbers. She looked at Arthur. His eyes were closed. She touched his wrist. A pulse, slow, strong. She called Mari back. Together, they checked everything. Power cables, battery backups, connections, all intact. The lights above the bed remained lit. The wall clock ticked on, but the equipment, every piece, refused to speak. Chaplain Romero arrived minutes later, summoned out of instinct more than protocol. He entered quietly, as always, not rushing, not demanding. He stood at the edge of the bed and looked first to Arthur, then to the machines, then to the statue visible through the open door of the chapel. "She's asking for silence," he said gently. No one laughed. No one questioned. They just listened. And as they did, the stillness deepened. Not hollow like absence, but full like a held breath before music. The air felt denser somehow, the shadows softer. And in that moment, the quiet wasn't frightening. It was sacred. Romero placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder and whispered a blessing, not in Latin, not in scripture, but in the language of gentle things. Then, slowly, one by one, the machines flickered back to life. First the heart monitor, then the oxygen meter, then the IV pump's rhythmic click. No settings had changed, no buttons pressed. They simply resumed, as if a hand had lifted from a pause button only it could touch. Later that night, when Mari reviewed the data logs, something caught her attention. During the silence, all vital signs had remained perfect. Heart rate steady at 72 BPM, oxygen at 97%, respiration smooth. Not a single skipped beat. As if the body no longer needed to be watched. Arthur, when asked the next morning if he remembered anything, opened his eyes just enough to say, "She held the noise back so I could rest." Then he smiled. That evening, staff found a small object on the floor near the chapel door. A thin silver medallion no one had seen before. A miraculous medal, worn at the edges, the figure of Mary faint but unmistakable. They placed it at the base of the statue. The machines never glitched again. But from that night forward, the room no longer felt clinical. It felt like waiting inside the hush of a church just before the choir begins. The waiting room outside the east wing was almost always empty after midnight. It faced the parking lot, where orange sodium lights cast long shadows over the few remaining vehicles. The vending machines hummed in the corner, offering stale crackers and blinking, "cash only." No one lingered there unless they had to. It was a place for pacing, not for peace. But around 2:00 a.m., the security guard on night watch noticed something on the hallway monitor. A figure sitting by the far window still, back straight, hands folded in her lap. He leaned closer. The resolution was poor, but the outline was clear. A woman, alone. He walked down the corridor to check in person. Turned the corner. The chair by the window was empty. No footsteps, no door open, no shift in air, just silence. He walked back, confused, and rewound the footage. She'd been there for 3 minutes, exactly, sitting, waiting, and in her lap he swore it were flowers. White blooms, faint even in black and white. The next night, she returned. This time 2 nurses saw her from the elevator bay. They didn't speak at first, thinking maybe a family member had returned for belongings. But as they approached, something felt off. The woman didn't move, didn't look up. She stared out the window, not toward the parking lot, but upward toward the chapel spire, barely visible in the distance. She wore a navy blue coat, barefoot again, pale hair coiled back, and when one of the nurses dared to call out, "Ma'am, do you need help?" she turned her head slightly. Not enough to reveal her face, just enough to acknowledge. Then she stood and walked into shadow. No footsteps. The third night, Mari stayed behind to see for herself. She waited in the dark corner of the waiting room, past visiting hours, watching the window through the glass pane in the door. Time passed slowly, minutes stretching like thread. Just as she considered giving up, the scent came. Lilies. Then the temperature dropped. Not uncomfortably, just noticeably. As though a breeze had moved through without touching the curtains. And there she was already seated. As if she had always been. Mari didn't move, didn't blink. The woman sat in silence, her gaze fixed upward, the folds of her coat resting neatly, hands cradling something soft in her lap. Mari leaned slightly, trying to glimpse her face, but the light from the hallway struck the window just enough to cast everything in silhouette. After 3 minutes, the woman stood. This time, she turned just enough for Mari to see the outline of her mouth. She was smiling, then she was gone. No exit, no sound, just empty chair and quiet air. Mari stepped into the room and found, resting on the seat, a single white lily. Still dewy, still fresh. No water, no note, just presence. It began with a phone call. A wrong number, according to the front desk. A woman asking gently, almost apologetically, to speak with Arthur Lindsley. "It's his wife," she said. "Margaret." The receptionist scanned the file. Arthur had no listed spouse. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she replied. "There's no Margaret on record." The line went quiet for a beat. Then the woman said, "Tell him the sewing box is where he left it." Click. The receptionist stared at the receiver for a long moment. She didn't write it down. Didn't mention it to anyone until 2 days later, when Mari found a small, worn sewing box placed at the foot of Arthur's bed. It hadn't been there during her previous rounds. The box was made of dark wood, the hinges rusted but intact. Inside, a silver thimble, faded blue thread, a pearl-top needle, and a folded handkerchief with the letter M embroidered in one corner. No card, no note, no fingerprints. Arthur stirred as she examined it. His eyes fluttered, then opened fully. Not groggily clearly. "Margaret used to fix my cuffs with that thread," he whispered. "Said a man should always look like someone's waiting for him at home." Mari couldn't speak. She helped him sit up, slowly, stacking pillows behind his back. He seemed stronger than yesterday, the hollows in his cheeks a little less deep, color returning to his hands. He reached out and took the box into his lap like a fragile bird. He didn't cry, just smiled. That night, Mari asked Chaplain Romero if he believed the dead could return not in spirit, but in acts, in objects, in messages that found their way through the veil. Romero answered only with a story. A woman in Italy who once found her grandmother's rosary lost decades earlier inside a locked drawer she'd never opened. "It's not about the object," he said. "It's about the love that refuses to vanish." Word of the sewing box spread quietly among the staff. Most dismissed it. Some leaned into the story. Others said nothing but checked room 209 with softer eyes. Then, late Saturday, a nurse named Clara passed by Arthur's open door and stopped in her tracks. He was sitting up, not being lifted, not propped. Sitting, fully, hands folded over the quilt, and he was humming. A tune no one recognized. Something slow, reverent, maybe a lullaby. The sewing box rested on the tray beside him, open. "Are you expecting someone?" Clara asked, half joking. Arthur smiled faintly. "She said I could go when I was ready." Clara didn't press. But when she turned to leave, she noticed something unusual about the curtain around his bed. A second handprint, smaller than the first, more delicate, pressed next to it, as if someone had stood beside the figure who'd watched over him all along. Together, waiting, No one expected him to leave his bed. That much was certain. Arthur Lindsley had not stood in nearly 4 months. Physical therapy had been discontinued after his muscles wasted past the point of bearing his own weight. His legs, pale and stiff beneath the sheets, were shadows of what they'd been. The orderlies rolled him gently each morning to avoid bed sores. Even sitting up unassisted had been marked as a hopeful exception in his chart. But on Monday morning, just after the 7:00 a.m. shift began, something changed. It was Clara who first noticed the silence, an unusual kind, the kind that comes before something sacred, like the pause before a hymn. The hallway outside room 209 had no motion, no voices, no buzz of intercoms or squeaking of wheels, just quiet. Then came the sound of feet, not rushed, not shuffling, steady. Clara turned toward the door just as it opened. Arthur stood there, no walker, no assistance, no panic in his eyes. He held onto the doorframe briefly, more out of familiarity than necessity, and took one step into the hallway. The staff froze. Time slowed. The monitor cables still trailed behind him like umbilical cords he'd outgrown. He looked at Clara, then smiled. "Think I've had enough rest." She stammered something, his name maybe, or just an exhale of disbelief. Then she reached for his arm, but he held up a hand. "I'm all right." The chaplain was summoned. So were two doctors. So was Mari, who dropped her coffee in the stairwell when she heard the news. They found him seated calmly in the chapel, hands folded, eyes closed, the statue of the Virgin Mary watching over him as if she'd been waiting for just this moment. The doctors ran tests, checked charts, demanded imaging, reflex assessments, mobility evaluations. Everything defied prognosis. There were no torn ligaments, no fractures, no tremors. The atrophy was real, but rapidly reversing. Somehow, tissue regeneration, muscle stimulation. Even the brain scans showed activity where before there had been silence. The official report listed the cause of mobility restoration as unknown neurological recovery with psychosomatic assistance. A medical way of saying, we have no idea. But those who had been near him, the nurses, the chaplain, the overnight staff, knew better. They had seen too much to believe it was just coincidence. Arthur remained calm through all of it. He answered questions politely, cooperated with every exam. But when no one was watching, when the room dimmed and the shadows lengthened toward evening, he would gaze quietly out the window, hands resting in his lap like he was holding something unseen. He never claimed a miracle. He never gave a speech. But when asked gently, privately, what had changed, he only ever said this: "She told me the light was waiting, and I still had steps left to take." And with each step, it seemed, something unseen moved with him. A presence, a promise. And lilies, always lilies, blooming where none had been before. The envelope appeared on the nurse's station desk just after sunrise. No one saw who placed it there. No camera caught the hand that left it. It was addressed in looping, careful script to the staff who kept the light. There was no postage, no return address. Just thick ivory paper, aged at the corners, and sealed with a faded wax impression, an old Marian emblem pressed into the center, nearly rubbed smooth. Mari was the first to open it. Inside was a single page, folded once. The ink was dark, almost too dark, like it had been written with urgency. The handwriting was delicate, the kind that comes from someone who once sent thank you cards for Sunday dinners, who knew the weight of words. To those who watched, who waited, who whispered kindness into the silence, he is well. He walks. He sleeps without pain. He no longer forgets the names of his hands or the shape of the moonlight on our old kitchen floor. I sit with him now, as he once sat for me, when age came too soon and time bent around grief. The statue never moved, but it did not need to. Some things speak without lips, and some voices travel better through stillness than through thunder. She did not walk, but she was there. Thank you for believing, even when you didn't understand. With Grace, M. There was no last name, no date, no indication of who had written it, only the initial and the echo of something final in the way the pen had slowed at the end. Clara insisted it had to be from Margaret. But the record showed Margaret Lindsley had died in 1998. Mari checked it herself. Obituary archived in the local press. Burial plot listed at St. Bridget's Cemetery. No recent activity on her name in any legal records, mail, or databases. Still, The letter remained. Real. Tangible. Chaplain Romero held it briefly and closed his eyes. She was never far, he said quietly. The hospital board never issued a statement. There were no headlines, no press coverage, just a slow ripple of murmurs, passed from one pair of hands to the next. Among staff, the letter was scanned, photocopied, and tucked into badge holders. Nurses pinned it to their break room wall. Aides folded it into prayer books. In room 209, it was cleaned, prepped for the next patient. But no one ever stayed long. Most requested a transfer after a night or two, not out of fear, but from something stranger. Dreams, they said, of gardens, of quiet laughter, of sewing boxes in blue thread and a woman's voice humming something that didn't belong to this century. The statue remained in the chapel. Still, but not silent. The morning he left, no one made an announcement. No gurney waited at the door. No wheelchair stood by, as policy required. No cluster of doctors crowding the hallway, scratching their heads and second-guessing notes. Just a single figure, standing at the threshold of room 209, dressed in a soft blue sweater and worn brown shoes. A simple canvas bag over one shoulder. Arthur Lindsley, alive, upright, smiling. He walked without effort. Slow, yes, but purposeful. Like every step belonged to him again. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes didn't drift. The staff on duty paused mid-routine, caught off guard by the simple, impossible truth unfolding in front of them. No discharge papers had been signed, no orders given, and yet no one stopped him. He made his way through the corridor like a man returning from somewhere far deeper than rest. As he passed the nurse's station, he gave Mari a small nod. She stood frozen, a clipboard in her hand, unsure whether to ask a question or say goodbye. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. That was all. But she heard something in them, something layered beneath the syllables. Gratitude not just for care, but for belief, for presence, for never turning away. As he reached the chapel doors, they opened not by hand, but gently, as if pushed by breath or memory. He stepped inside. The morning light through the stained glass painted the marble floor in streaks of violet and gold. Dust motes shimmered like stars. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood as it always had, arms open, face tilted in that serene, eternal hush. Arthur approached slowly. Then he did something no one expected. He knelt, not from weakness, from reverence. He bowed his head, resting one hand against the cold stone base. And for a moment, time held still. A nurse walking by stopped short. A custodian froze at the end of the hall. Even the ambient noise, the hum of machines, the distant coughs, the clatter of carts seemed to hush itself. Later, Mari would swear the air smelled faintly of lilies again. When Arthur stood, he touched the folds of the statue's robe, like one might touch the edge of a well-loved photograph. Then he turned, stepped through the chapel door, and walked straight out of Street Gabriel's hospital into the morning Sunday. No cane, no aides, no explanation. Just a man who had once been dying, now walking freely into a world that had not yet caught up with the miracle it had been handed. He was never readmitted. No follow-ups were filed, no further calls made. But a few weeks later, a bouquet of lilies arrived at the front desk, with no card, just a tag that read, "For the one who stayed with me, A." And from that day on, the staff referred to room 209 by a different name, the room where Grace waited.